The morning mist clung to the dense pine forest, like the breath of sleeping gods, as Bjorn Ironside made his way through the familiar hunting paths near his settlement. The autumn of 847 had been harsh, and winter approached with the promise of even greater hardships. His leather boots crunched softly on the carpet of fallen leaves, each step deliberate and measured. The experienced hunter knew that noise could mean the difference between a successful hunt and returning empty-handed to his longhouse. Bjorn paused beside a towering oak, its ancient bark scarred by countless seasons. He adjusted the grip on his iron-tipped spear, feeling the familiar weight of the ashwood shaft in his calloused hands. At 32 winters old, he had learned to read the forest like other men read the runes carved into stone. Today, something felt different. The usual sounds of the woodland creatures were subdued, replaced by an unsettling quiet that made the hair on his neck stand beneath his woolen cloak. As he moved deeper into the forest, following a game trail that wound between moss-covered boulders, a sound reached his ears that made him freeze. It was not the grunt of a wild boar or the rustle of a deer through the underbrush. Instead, he heard a low, pained whimper that spoke of desperation and suffering. Bjorn's weathered face, marked by years of sea spray and northern winds, creased with concern. He had heard such sounds before, usually from wounded animals caught in the iron traps that his people set for fur-bearing creatures. Moving carefully toward the source of the sound, Bjorn pushed through a thicket of young birch trees, their white bark gleaming like bone in the filtered sunlight. There, in a small clearing where wildflowers had once bloomed, he found the source of the distress. A large grey wolf, its thick winter coat already growing in preparation for the cold months ahead, lay trapped beneath a heavy iron snare. The metal teeth had closed around the animal's right hind leg, and dried blood stained the dark earth beneath. The wolf's yellow eyes met Bjorn's blue ones, and for a moment neither moved. The Viking had encountered wolves before, both in the wild and in the heat of battle, but this creature's gaze held an intelligence that struck him as unusual. There was no snarling or snapping, no display of the fierce aggression he expected from a cornered predator. Instead, the wolf watched him with what appeared to be resigned acceptance, as if it understood that its fate now rested in the hands of this human intruder. Bjorn studied the situation carefully. The trap was well made, crafted by the village blacksmith from good iron that would not break easily. It belonged to Thorvald the Trapper, a man known throughout their settlement for his skill in catching the valuable fur-bearing animals that provided both warmth and trade goods. To free this wolf would mean destroying valuable property, something that could lead to disputes and demands for compensation. Yet as Bjorn looked into the animal's eyes, he found himself remembering the stories his grandmother had told him as a child. Old Astrid had spoken of the ancient bonds between man and wolf, of times when the two species had hunted together under the same moon. She had taught him that all living creatures deserved respect, even those that might pose a threat. The wolf pack that roamed these forests had never bothered the settlement's livestock, preferring to hunt the abundant deer and elk that populated the region. Setting down his spear within easy reach, Bjorn approached the trapped animal slowly. The wolf tensed but did not attempt to bite or flee. Instead, it seemed to understand that this human meant no immediate harm. The Viking knelt beside the trap, examining the mechanism that held the creature prisoner. The iron jaws had closed with tremendous force, but the blacksmith had designed them to hold, not to kill, immediately. This gave Bjorn hope that the wolf's leg might not be broken beyond repair. Working with the patience learned from years of crafting and repairing tools, Bjorn used his eating knife to probe the trap's release mechanism. The metal was cold against his fingers, and he could feel the precision with which it had been forged. Thorvald took pride in his work, creating traps that could hold even the strongest animals until the trapper arrived to claim his prize. But every mechanism had its weakness, and Bjorn's experience with metalwork served him well as he located the pressure point that would open the jaws. The wolf remained still throughout the process, though Bjorn could see the rapid rise and fall of its chest and the way its ears swiveled at every sound. When the trap finally clicked open, the animal pulled its injured leg free with a soft whimper, but did not immediately flee. Instead, it turned its great head toward Bjorn, studying the man who had chosen to show mercy rather than claim a valuable pelt. For several heartbeats, Viking and wolf regarded each other in the quiet clearing. Then, with careful movements that favored its injured leg, the wolf rose to its feet. It was larger than Bjorn had initially realized, easily weighing as much as a grown man. The creature's grey coat was marked with darker patches around its shoulders and face, and its bushy tail hung low as it tested its weight on the wounded limb. Without warning, the wolf took a step toward Bjorn, who remained motionless despite every instinct telling him to reach for his spear. The animal stretched its neck forward and, in a gesture that would puzzle the Viking for days to come, gently touched its cold nose to Bjorn's outstretched hand. The contact lasted only a moment before the wolf turned and limped away into the dense forest, disappearing among the shadows and leaving only the scent of wild fur and the memory of ancient yellow eyes. Bjorn stood in the empty clearing long after the wolf had vanished into the forest depths. The broken trap lay open beside him, like the jaws of some defeated beast, its iron teeth gleaming dully in the afternoon light. He knew he would have to face Thorvald's anger when the trapper discovered his damaged property, but the memory of the wolf's intelligent gaze made any regret impossible. There had been something profound in that moment of connection, something that spoke to the deepest parts of his Norse soul. The walk back to the settlement took longer than usual. As Bjorn found himself distracted by thoughts of the encounter, the wolf had been magnificent, easily one of the largest he had ever seen. Its coat had been thick and healthy, suggesting it was well fed and strong despite its injury. Most striking of all had been its behavior. In all his years of hunting and trapping, Bjorn had never seen a wild animal show such restraint and apparent gratitude. Even wounded and vulnerable, the creature could have attempted to attack, yet it had chosen trust over aggression. As the familiar sight of his longhouse came into view through the trees, Bjorn felt the weight of his empty hands. He had set out that morning, hoping to bring back fresh meat for his family's table, but instead returned with nothing but an unusual story. His wife Sigrid would understand, he knew. She possessed the same respect for the natural world that his grandmother had instilled in him, but others in the settlement might question his judgment, especially when they learned about the destroyed trap. The longhouse that Bjorn called home was typical of their people's construction, built from thick oak logs and roofed with overlapping wooden shingles sealed with tar. Smoke rose from the central hearth, carrying the promise of warmth and the scent of cooking food. As he approached the heavy wooden door, he could hear the voices of his family within, speaking in the melodic tones of their Norse tongue. His two sons, Eric and Olaf, were likely helping their mother prepare the evening meal, while his daughter Thora would be working at her loom. Pushing open the door, Bjorn stepped into the familiar warmth of his home. The interior was lit by the glow of the central fire and several oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Carved pillars supported the roof beams, each decorated with intricate knotwork patterns that told the stories of his ancestors. Animal pelts covered the sleeping benches that lined the walls, while iron tools and weapons hung from wooden pegs, ready for use. Sigrid looked up from the iron cauldron where she was stirring a thick stew of barley, vegetables, and preserved meat. Her blonde hair was braided in the style of married women, and her blue dress was covered by a practical woolen apron. At 28 winters, she remained beautiful, though her hands showed the calluses of constant work, and her face bore the lines that came from years of worry about her family's welfare. When she saw Bjorn's empty hands, her expression showed concern rather than disappointment. "No luck in the forest today, husband?" she asked, her voice carrying the gentle accent of her birth region to the north. "The tracks have been scarce these past weeks. Even Thorvald complains that his traps yield less than in previous years." Eric, the elder of his sons at 15 winters, looked up from where he was sharpening his father's backup spear. The boy had inherited Bjorn's height and broad shoulders, though he had not yet filled out with the muscle that would come with full manhood. His hair was the colour of ripe wheat, and his green eyes held the eager intelligence of youth. "Father, did you see any sign of the wolf pack? Gunnar claims they've been moving closer to the settlement." Before Bjorn could answer, his younger son, Olaf, bounded over from where he had been feeding kindling to the fire. At 12 winters old, the boy was all energy and curiosity, constantly asking questions about everything from shipbuilding to the movements of the stars. His hair was darker than his brother's, more like his mother's honey-coloured locks, and his face still held the roundness of childhood. "Tell us about the hunt, father. Did you track any big game? Did you see bears?" Thora, his daughter of 17 winters, continued her work at the upright loom, but turned her head to listen. She had her mother's beauty, but had inherited Bjorn's strong will and independence. Many young men in the settlement had already approached Bjorn about marriage arrangements, but Thora had made it clear she would choose her own husband when she was ready. Her fingers never stopped moving the wooden shuttle through the vertical threads, creating a pattern that would become a new cloak for the winter months ahead. Bjorn removed his leather cloak and hung it on a wooden peg, then settled onto one of the benches near the fire. The warmth felt good against his skin after the cool air of the forest. He accepted a wooden cup of ale from Sigrid, taking a long drink of the honey-sweetened brew before beginning his story. "I encountered something unusual today," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the Longhouse. "Something that reminded me of your grandmother's old stories, Sigrid." The family gathered closer, drawn by the serious tone in Bjorn's voice. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to quiet as he recounted his discovery of the trapped wolf and his decision to free the injured animal. He described the creature's size and bearing, the intelligence in its yellow eyes, and the strange moment of connection they had shared. When he finished, silence filled the Longhouse, except for the gentle bubbling of the stew and the whisper of wind through the roof timbers. Eric was the first to speak, his young voice filled with excitement. "A wolf that large could feed half the settlement, father. Many would say you should have killed it while you had the chance." "Perhaps," Bjorn replied, meeting his son's eager gaze. "But sometimes the greatest wisdom lies in choosing mercy over profit. The wolf meant no harm to us, and it had harmed none of our livestock. To kill it simply because I could would have brought no honor to our family." Sigrid nodded approvingly, her hand reaching out to squeeze her husband's calloused fingers. "Your grandmother always said that the old gods watch how we treat the creatures of the wild. Perhaps this wolf was a test of your character, and you chose well." As the family resumed their evening activities, Bjorn found himself glancing toward the small windows cut into the Longhouse walls. Darkness was falling over the forest, and somewhere out there, a grey wolf was making its way through the trees on an injured leg. He wondered if their paths would ever cross again, unaware that the creature he had saved was already making decisions that would change both their lives forever. The first light of dawn crept through the small windows of Bjorn's Longhouse, casting pale rectangles across the wooden floor where his family still slept on their fur-covered benches. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only glowing embers that provided little warmth against the autumn chill. Bjorn stirred from his sleep, his warrior's instincts awakened by sounds that seemed out of place in the quiet morning hours. At first, he thought he might be hearing the normal activities of the settlement beginning their day. The sound of footsteps outside was not unusual, as people often rose early to tend to their animals or begin the day's work. But as consciousness fully returned to him, Bjorn realized that these footsteps were different. They were too soft, too careful, and there were too many of them moving in patterns that no human would follow. Quietly, so as not to wake his family, Bjorn rose from his sleeping bench and reached for his woolen cloak. The wooden floorboards creaked softly under his bare feet as he made his way toward the door, pausing only to retrieve his iron knife from where it hung on the wall. Whatever waited outside, he would face it prepared, though something deep in his mind whispered that weapons might not be necessary this morning. As he lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door, Bjorn heard Sigrid stirring behind him. His wife had always been a light sleeper, a trait that had served their family well during the dangerous years when raiders from rival settlements had threatened their peace. "What is it, husband?" she whispered, careful not to wake the children who still slept soundly on their benches. "I'm not certain," Bjorn replied in equally quiet tones. "But I hear movement outside that doesn't sound like our neighbors beginning their morning tasks. Stay here with the children until I determine what we face." Sigrid nodded, though she reached for her own knife and positioned herself where she could quickly wake their sons if danger threatened. Years of marriage to a warrior had taught her that vigilance was the price of survival in their harsh world. She watched as her husband slowly opened the door, ready to bar it again at the first sign of trouble. The sight that greeted Bjorn as he stepped outside his longhouse was unlike anything he had ever witnessed in his 32 years of life. Arranged in a rough semicircle around the front of his home were 7 wolves, their grey and brown coats clearly visible in the growing morning light. They sat on their haunches like well-trained hunting dogs, their breath creating small clouds of vapour in the cold air. At the centre of this unusual gathering sat the large grey wolf that Bjorn had freed from the trap just one day before. The injured wolf's leg appeared to be healing well, though Bjorn could see that the animal still favoured it slightly when it shifted position. The creature's yellow eyes met his once again, and in them, Bjorn saw the same intelligence and awareness that had so impressed him in the forest clearing. But now there was something else in that gaze, something that resembled the look a man might give when bringing gifts to honor a debt of gratitude. The other wolves were of various sizes and ages, clearly members of the same pack that roamed the forests around the settlement. There was an older female with grizzled fur around her muzzle, two younger males who appeared to be in their prime, and what looked like adolescent wolves who had not yet reached full size. None of them showed any signs of aggression or fear. Instead, they watched Bjorn with the same calm attention their leader displayed, as if waiting for some signal or acknowledgement. Behind him, Bjorn heard the soft sounds of his family awakening. Eric's voice, still thick with sleep, called out quietly, "Father, what do you see out there?" The young man had inherited his father's protective instincts and would not remain inside long if he sensed potential danger to his family. "Something remarkable," Bjorn replied without turning away from the wolves. "Something that your great-grandmother would have understood better than we do." The largest of the wolves, the one Bjorn had rescued, slowly rose to its feet and took a step forward. In its mouth, the creature carried something that made Bjorn's eyes widen with surprise. It was a freshly killed rabbit, its fur unmarked, except for the precise bite that had ended its life. The wolf approached to within arm's length of the Viking and gently placed the offering on the ground between them. Following their leader's example, the other wolves began to move forward, each carrying prey in their mouths. Soon the ground in front of Bjorn's longhouse was covered with an impressive display of forest game. There were 3 more rabbits, 2 fat grouse, and even a young deer that must have required the cooperation of several pack members to bring down. The wolves retreated to their original positions after making their offerings, once again sitting quietly and watching Bjorn with expectant eyes. The Viking stood frozen in amazement, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. In all the stories told by the skalds around winter fires, in all the tales passed down from generation to generation, he had never heard of wolves behaving in such a manner. Yet the evidence lay before him, fresh game that would feed his family for several days, brought by creatures that should have considered him an enemy, or at best, a threat to be avoided. Eric could no longer contain his curiosity and appeared beside his father, his hand instinctively moving to the handle of his knife, before stopping in wonder at the sight before them. "By Thor's hammer," he whispered, his young voice filled with awe. "They're making offerings like men do at the temple." The comparison was apt, Bjorn realized. The wolves' behavior did indeed resemble the ritual presentations made to the gods during important ceremonies. The careful arrangement of the gifts, the respectful distance maintained by the pack, and the patient waiting all suggested a level of understanding that challenged everything he thought he knew about wild animals. As if sensing that their message had been received and understood, the grey wolf rose once more to its feet. The creature looked directly into Bjorn's eyes for a long moment, then turned and began walking away toward the forest edge. The rest of the pack followed in orderly fashion, their forms gradually disappearing among the trees as the morning mist began to lift. Bjorn and Eric remained standing outside the longhouse long after the last wolf had vanished from sight. The pile of fresh game at their feet served as proof that the extraordinary encounter had truly occurred. But both men felt as though they had witnessed something that belonged more to legend than to their everyday world. "Father," Eric said finally, his voice thoughtful beyond his 15 years, "I think these wolves understand the concept of honor better than many men I know." Bjorn nodded slowly, still staring at the spot where the pack leader had disappeared. "Yes, my son, and I suspect this is far from the end of our dealings with them." Word of the wolves' dawn visit spread through the settlement like wildfire across dry grass. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered outside Bjorn's longhouse, drawn by rumors that grew more fantastical with each telling. Some claimed he had made a pact with the spirits of the forest, while others suggested the wolves were messengers from the gods themselves. The pile of fresh game that Bjorn had carefully preserved as evidence of the encounter served only to fuel more speculation and debate. Thorvald the Trapper arrived among the first wave of curious visitors, his weathered face dark with anger as he examined the broken remains of his iron trap that Bjorn had brought back from the forest. The man was shorter than most Vikings, but his reputation for ferocity in both hunting and fighting made others give him a wide berth. His grey beard was braided with small iron rings, and his leather clothing bore the permanent stains of his trade. "So it's true then," Thorvald growled, holding up the damaged trap for all to see. You destroyed my property to free a wolf, and now you claim the beast brought you gifts in return. His voice carried the skepticism of a practical man who had little patience for what he considered foolish sentiment. This trap was worth 3 silver coins, Bjorn Ironside. I expect compensation for your act of misguided mercy. Before Bjorn could respond, Magnus the Elder stepped forward from the crowd. At 60 winters old, Magnus was one of the most respected men in the settlement. His long white beard and numerous battle scars, testament to a lifetime of wisdom and experience. He wore the simple brown robes of his position as the settlement's law speaker, and his pale blue eyes studied the situation with careful consideration. Peace. Thorvald, Magnus said, his voice carrying the authority that came with his years and position. Let us hear the full tale before we speak of compensation and wrongdoing. Bjorn is known to us all as a man of honor and sound judgment. If he chose to free a trapped wolf, he surely had good reason. Bjorn nodded gratefully to the elder, then began to recount the events of the previous day and that morning's extraordinary visit. He spoke carefully, sticking to the facts as he had witnessed them, avoiding any embellishment that might make his story seem less credible. The crowd listened in fascination as he described the wolf's intelligent behavior and the pack's organized presentation of gifts. Among the listeners stood Gunnar the blacksmith, a massive man whose arms bore the burns and scars of his trade. His forge provided the settlement with everything from farming tools to weapons, and his practical nature made him skeptical of tales that seemed to stretch beyond normal experience. Wolves don't think like men, he declared when Bjorn finished his account. They're clever hunters, yes, but they don't understand gratitude or honor. You're reading human thoughts into animal behavior. Then how do you explain this? Eric interjected, gesturing toward the pile of game. The young man's voice carried the passion of youth, but his words were measured and thoughtful. 7 wolves approached our home without aggression, left fresh kills as offerings, and departed peacefully. When has anyone here witnessed such behavior from wild predators? Astrid, the wise woman, pushed through the crowd, her ancient frame supported by a walking stick carved with protective runes. At 78 winters, she was the oldest person in the settlement and served as both healer and keeper of the old traditions. Her cloudy eyes studied Bjorn with an intensity that seemed to look beyond his physical form into his very soul. The old stories speak of such things, she said, her voice crackling like dry leaves in the wind. In the time before the White Christ came to southern lands, our ancestors knew that the boundary between man and beast was not as solid as we now believe. There were warriors who could speak with ravens, hunters who ran with wolf packs, and shamans who took the forms of bears. Thorvald snorted in derision. Old women's tales and children's stories. We live in the real world, where wolves are wolves and men are men. This changes nothing about the fact that my trap was destroyed, and I deserve compensation. The debate continued for most of the morning, with the settlement divided between those who saw the event as evidence of something miraculous, and those who insisted on more practical explanations. Some suggested that the wolves might be suffering from a disease that affected their behavior, while others worried that the pack might become dangerous if they lost their natural fear of humans. Sigrid emerged from the Longhouse, carrying wooden cups of ale for the elders, her presence bringing a measure of calm to the increasingly heated discussion. Her reputation as a woman of wisdom and good judgment made her words carry weight among both men and women of the settlement. Whether we understand the wolves' reasons or not, she said, we cannot deny that they have shown our family great kindness. Perhaps we should consider what our response should be, rather than arguing about what their actions meant. Magnus stroked his white beard thoughtfully. The woman speaks wisely. If these wolves have chosen to ally themselves with one of our families, we must decide how the settlement will react. Do we treat them as friends, as enemies, or simply as wild animals to be avoided? Young Olaf, who had been listening quietly to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that sometimes came from a child's perspective. If they wanted to hurt us, they could have attacked father when he was alone in the forest. Instead, they brought food to thank him for his kindness. Doesn't that make them friends? The simple logic of the 12-year-old boy's words seemed to cut through much of the complex debate that had consumed the morning. Several people nodded in agreement, while others looked thoughtful as they reconsidered their positions. Even Thorvald's expression softened slightly, though he remained focused on his practical concerns. Friends or not, the trapper said, I still need compensation for my broken trap. The iron alone was worth more than most families see in a month. Bjorn had expected this demand and was prepared for it. You'll have your compensation, Thorvald, but not in silver. I'll work in your trap lines for a full month, helping you check and reset your snares. My labor should more than cover the value of one broken trap. The offer was generous, as Bjorn's skills as a hunter and tracker were well known throughout the settlement. Thorvald considered the proposal for several moments before nodding grudgingly. A month of your time, plus you help me craft 2 new traps to replace the one that was lost. Agreed. Agreed, Bjorn replied, clasping the trapper's forearm in the traditional gesture of a binding agreement. As the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying their own interpretation of the morning's events back to their families, Magnus approached Bjorn with a thoughtful expression. You've set something in motion here that may have consequences none of us can foresee, the elder said quietly. I hope you're prepared for whatever comes next. Bjorn looked toward the forest where the wolf pack had disappeared, wondering the same thing himself. 3 weeks passed after the wolves' first visit, and life in the settlement gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Bjorn had kept his promise to Thorvald, spending long days checking trap lines and crafting new snares from iron and strong rope. The work was tedious but familiar, and it gave him time to think about the extraordinary events that had changed his family's place in the community. Some neighbors still regarded him with suspicion, while others sought his counsel on matters related to the forest and its creatures. During this time, the wolf pack made no further appearances near the settlement, though hunters and trappers reported seeing them at a distance. The grey wolf that Bjorn had rescued seemed to have recovered fully from its injury, leading the pack with the same confidence and intelligence that had impressed the Viking during their first encounter. These sightings reassured those who worried that the wolves might have become too comfortable around humans, but they also left Bjorn wondering if he would ever see his unusual benefactors again. The answer came on a cold morning when frost covered the ground like scattered silver coins. Bjorn was preparing to check the last series of traps in his agreement with Thorvald when Eric burst into the Longhouse, his face flushed with excitement and concern. The young man had been practicing his hunting skills in the forest when he had witnessed something that demanded his father's immediate attention. "Father, you must come quickly," Eric said, still breathing hard from his run back to the settlement. "The wolves are in the forest, but they're not alone. There are strangers with them, and they don't look like traders or travelers seeking shelter." Bjorn immediately reached for his weapons, strapping on his sword and taking up his favorite spear. If armed strangers were in their territory, especially ones somehow connected to the wolf pack, the situation could quickly become dangerous. "How many men?" he asked as he secured his leather armor and woolen cloak. "I counted at least 8, maybe more hidden in the trees," Eric replied. "They wear different armor than ours, and their weapons are strange. But father, the wolves weren't attacking them. They seemed to be leading them somewhere, as if the men were following the pack willingly." This news troubled Bjorn deeply. Foreign warriors following wolves through their forest could mean many things, none of them good for the settlement's safety. He made a quick decision that would have far-reaching consequences. "Wake your brother and tell him to alert Magnus and the other warriors. If these strangers mean trouble, we'll need every sword ready. But first, I'm going to find out what's happening in our forest." Sigrid appeared from the back of the Longhouse, her face showing the worry that came naturally to a warrior's wife. "Take Eric with you," she said firmly. "2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and if you're walking into danger, you'll need someone to watch your back." Father and son made their way through the forest paths with the caution learned through years of hunting dangerous game. The frost-covered leaves crunched softly under their boots despite their efforts to move quietly, and their breath formed small clouds in the cold air. As they approached the area where Eric had witnessed the unusual gathering, Bjorn held up his hand for silence and motioned for his son to take cover behind a large fallen log. The sight that greeted them was indeed extraordinary. In a natural clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, the wolf pack sat in their characteristic semicircle, just as they had done outside Bjorn's Longhouse. But now they faced a group of 8 foreign warriors who knelt on the frozen ground in what appeared to be a gesture of respect or supplication. The strangers wore mail shirts of a different style than Norse armor, and their shields bore symbols that Bjorn didn't recognize. At the center of the foreign group knelt a man who was clearly their leader. He was perhaps 40 winters old, with dark hair streaked with grey, and a beard braided in the fashion of warriors from the eastern lands. His armor was well made but showed the wear of long travel, and his weapons were those of a seasoned fighter. Most remarkably, he held his hands open and empty before the grey wolf that Bjorn had rescued, as if making some sort of offering or plea. The wolf leader studied the foreign warrior with the same intelligent gaze that Bjorn remembered so well. After several long moments, the great grey animal rose to its feet and approached the kneeling man. To Bjorn's amazement, the wolf touched its nose to the warrior's forehead, in what appeared to be a gesture of acceptance or blessing. The foreign leader's shoulders sagged with relief, and he spoke words in a language that Bjorn couldn't understand. Suddenly, the grey wolf's head turned toward the fallen log where Bjorn and Eric were hidden. Those piercing yellow eyes found Bjorn's blue ones across the clearing, and the Viking realized that the pack leader had known of their presence all along. The wolf rose and began walking deliberately toward their hiding place, followed closely by the foreign warrior and his companions. Bjorn made a quick decision and stepped out from behind the log, his spear ready but not raised in immediate threat. Eric followed his example, though the young man's hand remained near his sword hilt. The foreign warriors stopped several paces away, their own weapons sheathed but easily accessible. The tension in the clearing was thick as winter ice, with both groups of men uncertain about the other's intentions. The grey wolf approached Bjorn without fear, just as it had done outside his longhouse. The creature's behavior seemed to reassure the foreign warriors, who watched the interaction with obvious fascination. Their leader stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented Norse, his words careful but understandable. "You are the one called Bjorn Ironside," the foreign warrior said, his voice carrying the roughness of a man accustomed to shouting orders over the clash of battle. "The Wolf King has told us of your kindness to his pack. I am Dmitri of Kiev, and I come seeking the wisdom of one who speaks with the forest spirits." Bjorn was taken aback by the man's words, but he maintained his warrior's composure. "I speak with no spirits," he replied firmly. "I simply showed mercy to an injured animal, as any man of honor should do. What brings warriors from Kiev to our forests? And how do you know of my encounter with this wolf?" Dmitri's weathered face showed a mixture of desperation and hope. "My lord, we have traveled for many weeks following rumors and old stories. Our homeland faces a terrible threat, and our wise men say that only one who has gained the trust of the wolf spirits can help us. We have seen how these creatures honor you, and we believe you are the one we seek." The foreign warrior went on to explain that Kiev was besieged by enemies who seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts in the night. Their conventional military tactics had proven useless against foes who struck swiftly and vanished into the wilderness before defenders could respond. Desperate leaders had consulted ancient texts and sought the advice of old shamans, who spoke of northern warriors who had learned to hunt with wolves as allies. "We do not ask you to fight our battles," Dmitri continued, his voice growing more urgent. "We ask you to teach us what you have learned about working with the wolf spirits. In return, we offer gold, silver, and weapons forged by the finest smiths in the eastern lands." Bjorn looked at the wolf pack, who had arranged themselves in their usual semicircle and seemed to be waiting for his response to the stranger's request. The grey leader watched him with those intelligent eyes, and Bjorn found himself wondering if the animal truly understood the conversation taking place. Whatever strange bond existed between them had apparently led these foreign warriors across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. "I have learned nothing that can be taught," Bjorn said, finally. "What exists between my family and these wolves is based on simple respect and kindness. If your enemies are men, then you fight them with swords and strategy, not with forest spirits." But even as he spoke the words, Bjorn felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a heavy cloak. The wolves had brought these desperate warriors to him for a reason, and refusing their plea might have consequences that extended far beyond his own small settlement. The decision weighed heavily on Bjorn's mind as he returned to the settlement with Eric and the foreign warriors. Magnus the Elder had listened carefully to Dmitri's story and the desperate plea from Kiev, his weathered face growing more thoughtful with each detail. The prospect of one of their own travelling so far from home to help strangers was troubling, yet the potential alliance with distant lands could bring prosperity to their small community. "The choice is yours to make, Bjorn Ironside," Magnus had said after hearing all the facts. "But remember that your actions reflect upon all of us. If you choose to help these men, you carry our honor with you. If you refuse, they may become enemies who remember our lack of hospitality." That evening, as the foreign warriors made camp outside the settlement, Bjorn sat by his hearth, wrestling with the decision that would change his family's life forever. Sigrid worked quietly at her loom, but he could feel her concerned gaze upon him. Eric and Olaf sat nearby, pretending to occupy themselves with carving and weapon maintenance while actually listening to every word of their parents' whispered conversation. "The wolves brought them here for a reason," Sigrid said finally, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "In all the old stories, when the forest spirits choose a person for some purpose, refusing their call brings only misfortune. But I fear what might happen if you travel so far from home." Thora looked up from her weaving, her young face serious beyond her 17 years. "Father, what if this is how the gods mean for our family's saga to unfold? Great deeds are never accomplished by men who stay safely at home by their hearths." Before Bjorn could respond, a soft scratching sound came from outside the Longhouse door. The family fell silent, recognizing the deliberate nature of the noise. It was not the random scraping of wind-blown branches, but something purposeful and measured. Eric moved to the door and carefully lifted the wooden bar, opening it just wide enough to peer outside. "Father," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder, "you need to see this." Bjorn joined his son at the door and found himself looking at a sight that would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his days. The entire wolf pack sat in the moonlit space before his longhouse, their forms clearly visible in the silver light. But they were not alone. Each wolf sat beside one of the foreign warriors, the men and animals arranged in pairs, as if they had been deliberately matched for some ceremony. At the center of this remarkable gathering, Dmitri knelt beside the great grey wolf, his hand resting gently on the creature's thick fur. The wolf's yellow eyes reflected the moonlight as they met Bjorn's gaze, and in that moment, the Viking understood what was being communicated without words. The pack had made their choice, just as they had done when they first brought gifts to his doorstep. Bjorn stepped outside, followed by his entire family. The night air was cold against their faces, and frost was already forming on the wooden buildings and bare tree branches. The foreign warriors watched him approach with expressions that mixed hope and resignation, understanding that their fate hung in the balance of his decision. "It seems the choice has been made for me," Bjorn said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "The wolves have accepted you as they once accepted my family. I cannot ignore such a clear sign." Dmitri rose to his feet, his weathered face showing profound relief. "You will come with us to Kiev? You will help us learn what you know of working with these magnificent creatures?" "I will come," Bjorn replied, "but not to teach you magic or forest spirits. I will come to show you what I have learned about respect, trust, and the bonds that can form between different kinds of hunters when they recognize each other's honor." The preparation for the journey took 3 days, during which the entire settlement worked to equip Bjorn for the long travel ahead. Gunnar the blacksmith forged new arrowheads and sharpened his best sword until it could split a hair. The women wove warm cloaks and gathered provisions that would not spoil during weeks of travel. Magnus provided silver arm rings that could be used for trade or tribute, while Astrid the wise woman prepared healing herbs and protective charms. Most remarkably, the wolves remained near the settlement during these preparations, showing no signs of their usual wariness around large groups of humans. The pack seemed to understand that a momentous journey was being planned, and their presence served as a constant reminder to Bjorn of the unusual alliance that had made this adventure possible. On the morning of departure, as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky pale gold, Bjorn embraced his family one final time. Sigrid's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady as she wished him a safe journey and swift return. Eric and Olaf promised to protect their mother and sister, while Thora made him swear to bring back stories of the great cities and foreign lands he would see. "Remember," Sigrid whispered as she held him close, "you carry our love with you no matter how far you travel. The wolves brought these strangers to you, but it is your own honor and wisdom that will see you safely home again." As the group of warriors and wolves set out from the settlement, heading toward the rising sun and the distant lands beyond the eastern forests, Bjorn looked back once at the familiar shapes of the longhouses and workshops that had been his world for 32 years. He knew that he would return changed by whatever lay ahead, but he also knew that the bonds forged in this place would remain unbroken, regardless of distance or time. The great grey wolf trotted beside his horse, occasionally looking up at the Viking with those intelligent yellow eyes that had started everything with a single moment of trust in a forest clearing. Bjorn reached down to touch the animal's thick fur, feeling the strength and warmth beneath his fingers. Whatever adventures awaited them in the vast world beyond their northern home, they would face them together as allies bonded by mutual respect and ancient understanding. Behind them, smoke rose from the settlement's hearths, carrying the prayers and hopes of families who trusted that their bonds of kinship and community were strong enough to survive any test. And in the forest that had witnessed the beginning of this extraordinary alliance, the morning wind whispered through the trees like the voices of ancestors blessing a new chapter in the endless saga of human courage and animal wisdom.